Welcome to the third season of That's So Second Millennium, the Catholic Science podcast where we explore the fascinating borderlands between science and theology through realms of philosophy, human experience, and more. Welcome back to That's So Second Millennium, episode 116. So this is our final episode of the year 2020. Good riddance, as many of us would probably say. So Bill and I take this chance to have a conversation about some concepts about what's going on in society in terms of our ability to pay attention to things and our ability to focus. We discussed Pope Francis a lot more than I intended to. I started out this episode with the intention of talking about the sort of weaponization of attention in culture where we choose not, where we're seeing some efforts to use attention and censorship to determine whether people pay attention to things like Trump's disputes of the election, the lawsuits going on, which, you know, taking no side whatever on the factual merits of the case, it's simply interesting to watch how censorship has become acceptable in that sense. That I don't see another way to look at that. So we start from there, but we talk about a lot of things in society and what we're able to pay attention to. And it takes us to some pretty interesting places. Some pretty sobering places, but again, it's still 2020. So next year will be 2021, and we'll see if we can be a little bit more cheerful. Thank you, dear listeners, and have a blessed Christmas and New Year.
Curiosity is a healthy thing, and in fact, I know that Pope Francis talked about that in one of the World Communications Day things. As you know, it's part of cherishing the truth. To be curious, to ask more questions, not fewer. So that's the kind of thing that I might add in at some point. But you take it away. Take it away, Anchorman.
Yeah. I do. However, I still think you and I need to get together at some point when all this insanity is over with, and and watch Network together. I think that should.
Whoa! You have got a deal. I still think every day that not every day, but it's truly more prophetic than ever.
Yeah, one of those things.
The world is one great cosmos of corporations, and that is exactly what we're seeing now.
Yeah, it's weird how it's a cosmos. There's scope for individual people to do things they couldn't do in 1975 or 1990, and yet at the same time, these massive corporations, they're just a different set of massive corporations that own everything.
That's right.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's right. They're no longer the Exxons or the AT&Ts.
Or the CBS.
Or the CBS.
And NBC are now the sort of, appendages flopping behind, these other things.
That's right. Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
I think I almost have to think we'll have Morgan leave some of that in the cut, but to actually start us out, yes, that's So Second Millennium, including the movie.
That's
Network. Right. Was So Second Millennium, and yet le plus ça change, le plus c'est la même chose. So yeah, today to close out the year, actually, I believe we're probably recording our last episode of the year 2020. Good riddance.
Not a moment too soon, right? To get rid of that year.
Right. So, yeah. So today we want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on in society in terms of. I proposed to Bill the topic in quotes weaponization of attention, and discussing how that's playing out, in the specifics. Obviously, we don't need to dance around too much the question of there's the disputed, that Donald Trump is still disputing the election. He still has, he and his team still have lawsuits ongoing in several of the swing states that I guess if they all went through, they would, presumably actually flip the election. And the question is, how, and of course, in the last few days, as we're recording this on December 11th, the Feast of Pope Damasus, for what that's worth.
I was inattentive to that. That's interesting. Yeah.
He's this figure that always sort of sticks in my mind. Not that I actually know that much about him. Like the summary in the Missal for today comments that he was actually the one. He was actually the one, and he is right at just after the time of Constantine, so very close to the legalization of the church, before Theodosius actually made Christianity, the legal religion. They promoted legal religion. So there was like a 50-year gap where it was presumably more of an early attempt at some sort of religious freedom situation that probably
interesting, yeah.
Either deserves more study or at least more, broad, discussion of that era than it presumably gets, than it seems to get from my perspective. But anyway, but Pope Damasus is in that period and is actually presumably the one who changed the official language of the Church of Rome from Greek to Latin, because Christianity in the early centuries spread among Greek-speaking communities because people from the East spoke Greek. And there were Greek-speaking people all across the empire, and certainly in Rome. I mean, it's like asking, are there people who speak Spanish in New York City? Yes, as a matter of fact, there are.
Yes.
So the same thing was true in Rome. Are there people who speak? Oh, yes, there are people who speak Greek. There is an enormous community of people who speak Greek. And the church was largely in that community, more so in that community, certainly in its early centuries. And then, of course, the church is conservative, as most things really are, even if they don't want to be identified as conservative. And so they were still using Greek as the liturgical language, I guess, until Pope Damasus. So Pope Damasus was an interesting figure to look back on from the perspective of, the 20th century and the changeover from Latin to the vernacular and all the various languages.
Right.
I have to think that his example is at least present in some people's minds who are engineering that change. That's gosh. If I could just disappear into a pocket dimension where time didn't pass and read for, 50 years or something like that, that would definitely be on the docket of things I would like to read. Is some discussion of that. But to bring it back to the present day, we're talking about, not just paying attention to the question about the election and the fact that, I guess you said Facebook. I was familiar with YouTube as apparently, mass labeling things that, debate whether the election was fair or just not acceptable. This is fake news. This is
discussion of voter fraud. Yeah.
So, So that's yeah, and of course, that's really funny to me from the perspective of like, boy, there's crazy stuff on YouTube. There's crazy stuff on YouTube. Yeah, conspiracy theories galore about like just. You could almost throw ideas into a hopper and play Mad Libs, and at this point, there's probably a YouTube video espousing whatever idea would be engendered by put these 5 words together.
Yes, to me, I was going to say that one of the joys of YouTube all along has been that you can find anybody saying anything, and that's part of what our Constitution celebrates. We're more creative, more entrepreneurial, and more successful ultimately by being able to think our own thoughts and to kind of hash them out in a free marketplace of ideas, a la John Stuart Mill, who I've gathered fewer and fewer people are actually reading and learning about, but and that's to me, that was kind of the liberal foundation of wanting to be a journalist. And I can understand why journalism would attract liberal people with that definition of the term, especially because liberal is a freeing of the mind and a bringing to fulfillment, a purposeful fulfillment of the potential of the human being by being able to be attentive to what you're inclined to be attentive to, and by sharing your ideas and putting them in reasonable and civil competition with other people's ideas. Great concept. and we better. I hope we don't lose it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things that it's in the, the America of the 19th and 20th centuries that was, cobbled together in the 18th century. I mean, and just thinking about how crazy it was that all came together. I mean, I can't read history and then look at the American Revolution and think, how did that possibly, there were so many points at which that could and would in almost any other, you would expect, 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, it would get crushed at this point. It would get crushed at this point. People would never, this next thing would never happen. And it somehow, carried itself off all the way to actually, a functioning central government and, the United States of America as a going concern on these principles. And then it somehow lived through, the Civil War and the insane. American history in the 18th and 19th centuries is just I don't think we appreciate how crazy it was that America lived through all of that. Indeed. And came into the 20th century as a strong, unified country. That doesn't happen. I mean, people don't put together ramshackle revolutions against, something like the British Empire. I mean, where else did that happen? Where else did that happen? Canada didn't do that. South Africa didn't do that. They tried. They failed. India didn't do that. Australia didn't do that. It didn't succeed anywhere else. Why on earth did it succeed in the 13 colonies? And then you think about the bloodbath of the Civil War. I mean, that the South was willing to pay that price to try to be separate, and that the North was willing to pay that price to force them to stay, and that the country somehow got over it.
Yes.
I mean, that by the 1880s, it was okay, we're, one country again, and we're just kind of carrying on the way we're carrying on, and no, slavery is not a thing anymore. I mean, and it was terrible that, the Jim Crow system got put back in place, but it was also kind of people don't change that much that fast.
No, that's right.
I mean, and it was amazing that the incredible amount of carnage and the bloodbath and there could not have helped but be atrocities on both sides.
Right.
And the country somehow came back together. And, of course, there's, it's not surprising that there's a lot of people who've written, alternate histories that, where the Civil War is the fulcrum point, where, the point of divergence from, the world as we actually have it. Because it really seems like it could have gone a very different way. Yeah. So for these principles, it's almost not surprising if we're losing them, because we're really swimming against human tendencies. People want to believe that they're right. People don't want to listen to people who don't think that they're right. People, and the church has arguably been, the popes have arguably taken bad tactics about that in the past. I think it would be a fruitful discussion, whether the index of prohibited books or forbidden books was ever actually a good idea, whether it was ever actually likely to work well, whether it was in fact, not misused in certain ways, for Pope's political ends, as opposed to an actual trying to see this people's spiritual condition.
Right.
It's the sort of thing that you can be kind of gung-ho Catholic and sort of no, of course there were problems. Of course there were problems. We know there were problems. And you can get too myopic. It's there's a certain breed of people who I've seen, speaking of things on YouTube that you could censor if you wanted to, that, trying to, that are, debating, Francis, he's just a bad Pope. And I just I put my face in my hands. I'm like, you guys did look up a list of the popes. Find any pope from the 10th century, from the 900s. Get on, newadvent.org/Cathin. Look up the Catholic Encyclopedia from whatever it is. I forget, 1910, 1905, 1915. It's somewhere in that era. And look at what they had to say about those popes. And if you find one that by accident was sort of okay, follow it forward or follow it backward 4 or 5 and take a little sample. They were terrible human beings. An awful lot of them were terrible human beings. And we know that. I mean, that's already baked in. We understand that popes can be terrible human beings. Not, I disagree with his politics. Like, for a good reason, maybe. I mean, you could pull a political point or six. I mean, but I frankly think Pope Francis is a little too long-winded in his encyclicals. Like, I don't want to sit down to an encyclical and be like, and now I have 300 pages to read, inside myself. Like, I've sat down, I did start reading, what's the one from this year?
Fratelli Tutti. Fratelli Tutti.
Okay, yeah. I've started reading it, and frankly, I'm with him for the most part so far. But it's like, and I look at that scroll bar, I'm like, I haven't gotten very far.
Yeah.
Golly.
Well,
it's not a letter anymore. It's not.
No, that's right.
Letter.
Yeah.
But all that said, it's like he's well above the waterline. Like, we don't need to be discussing things in these terms.
And usually someone who kind of writes that much and makes so many connections, I think that's actually one of his personality strengths, but one that might rub a lot of people the wrong way. He sees everything as connected to everything else, and his mind hyperlinks from this to that to the other thing. And so his encyclicals become long, and he might make a connection to something that, that jars you because that's not how you see a thought connecting to other thoughts.
No, I mean, the papal encyclical is a distinct category of literature where it's, there is arguably a price to be paid for making it too broad, because, I mean, what purpose does an encyclical serve in the church and in the world? I mean, because of course it is, justifiably, addressed to all people of, who are willing to read him, all people of goodwill, which is to say anyone who's willing to listen to what he has to say and actually do anything other than in a Protestant or Islamic or whatever, or secular, militant, atheistic sort of way, just read it to try to mine it for points to criticize him about. I mean, I take it personally. My interpretation of it, broadly speaking, is that he's encouraging us to think about, our politics. But, at the same time, it's like you can't possibly enshrine everything that he said as, a matter of faith and morals about which the Pope is going to be, teaching, infallibly.
Right.
Because he's talking about things that are clearly practical political questions from time to time, and we should think about those. And so that brings it back, like, okay, I can appreciate that we should be thinking about those more. We should not be like, pushing aside, into this sort of antiseptic, sort of devotional world where that's where, our Catholic identity revolves around these practices, and maybe we make ourselves more Catholic because we engage in some of these practices on weekdays as well as on Sunday, but we're still not really changing how we interact with the rest of the world. So of course we've been talking to Aida, and, hopefully we'll talk to her some more, about economics, and how we choose to go about our business is relevant to our eternal salvation. Because it's relevant to how we're treating other people. We should not, there is and isn't. I mean, there are ways in which things are very different from the time of the Gospels, and yet in the same way, it's still like, you think I was thinking that, and I'm like, because we see so many more economic possibilities than they did back then.
Yes.
I mean, like, in the 1st century, in the 13th century, in the 15th century, people just, people didn't look at the world and say, how could we completely change how we, distribute goods, how we generate and distribute goods? Well, we could have the government plan it all and run it into, like, if anybody thought that, it was like an idle daydream in a scriptorium, somewhere that wasn't going to go anywhere, because people simply governments simply weren't capable of that level of control. They just weren't.
Right.
And so we can do these things now. And yet at the same time, I'm saying that, and then I call myself back, well, what about what, like John the Baptist's admonition to, like, in particular, what he was addressing to soldiers is like, don't cheat people. Oh, yeah, don't cheat people. Yeah, that's a good idea. I think it's tax collectors too. Oh yeah. That's part of how people, don't extort from people, don't cheat people, don't, engage in these things. And what, makes it difficult today, because we have so many ways that we can insulate ourselves, because we're sort of doing things at a distance, like derivatives.
Well said, right? Yeah,
what we're doing is so distant from the other people at the other end of the transaction that we sort of lose sight of, like, maybe we're actually deceiving these people. Maybe we're actually taking advantage of people in these ways.
Yes. Oh, I think that there are real dangers in how we distance ourselves from other people and our impact on other people just through the words we say, either as marketers or as advocates for particular positions. We really do it. We're not showing respect for the dignity of the other person, of our necessary relationship with that person. And there's so much that distances us from each other. Ironically, at a time when things like social media and all are promising to bring us closer together, we've seen how that promise is not really being kept true. These communities that form on social media are really more about who you exclude than whom you include, and confirmation bias, etc. And so, and with that kind of distancing through words and through affiliations and what you believe and what news you accept, no wonder people are becoming less attentive to what other people are saying, and it kind of goes in one ear and out the other. Partly because it's being manipulated and everything. And then, of course, it's in the context of these great fire hoses of information that is coming out at us every day. Anyway, I call it information inflation. When, there's so much, right? You can learn so much every day. So just as so many dollar bills are being printed, figuratively speaking.
Right.
So much information is being mass printed every day that you can't really blame people for wanting to filter it out.
Yeah.
But sadly, also they've
got to. It's a matter of survival. It's an absolute matter of survival.
Right. Yeah. Oh, our mind
literally drown in it.
Yeah. Mind blown, as they say.
Right.
But at the same time, why can't we kind of enjoy the fact that there is this information if we find it out and pursue it prudently and in a focused way, with a certain amount of curiosity that's based on principles. In other words, what can we learn today that's going to make the world better tomorrow? What questions can we ask? And unfortunately, that's not what's driving most people's pursuit of or use of information.
I
Signaling
mentioned at some point
bias.
The Distracted Mind, this very academic book about.
I'd be interested in reading that one.
you would, I think you would enjoy and get a lot out of it. It is, as I say, a very academic text.
Fair enough. Yeah. But I am concerned that we are distancing ourselves from each other. And the more we're distanced emotionally, as well as by the use of information and the use of words and the use of kind of manipulative media, we're just naturally going to pay less attention to the times of the times of our lives, the details of our lives, and God is in the details. We have to be attentive.
Yeah. Yeah. God appears to us in the specifics of our lives.
Yes. Of course, the devil's also in the details. I believe in that maxim too. And of course, even more important to be attentive if both God and the devil.
As the Jesuits would point out, we need to pay attention to both the good and the movements of both the good and the evil spirit, so that we can
exactly. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So the attentiveness is. I think it's a big issue, and it is being weaponized, and it's being kind of deadened in a lot of ways, to the point where there is a risk that media and other powerful organizations are going to feel it's easier and more useful to distract our attention, and even to control our attention to certain things. Mm-hmm. And that's so radically different from the liberal ethos of John Stuart Mill, et cetera, the free marketplace of ideas, which is really what the entrepreneurial spirit of America is based on. Yeah, we were talking about things like how the United States was very unique, and we need to.
There are people on one side of the conversation who are very upset about the whole American exceptionalism thing, and that can be taken way too far. I mean, we're made up of human beings like anybody else, and there are certainly things politically and culturally that the United States does not lead the world in. And you could probably find some things where we are in fact distinctly bad. But that would be to focus on that, or to just say, that, I don't know. I mean, that's the thing is like, I don't really even know what the counterpoint to quote American exceptionalism is. Like, you would think it would be, we're people like other people. And frankly, I think that attitude should be more common in our political discourse. I guess there really is the counterpoint really is that, it's both American exceptionalism. It's just whether you think America is distinctly good or distinctly bad. That there really is this, on the leftist secularist side, there is this belief that America is distinctly bad. And I'm like, I think there's some unique, yes, that's the thing, is like, it's so much of it centers around the race question, but of course a lot of it's also what you were just talking about, the whole free market thing, and, and entrepreneurial spirit. And there's a certain gross sort of capitalist in the sense that Chesterton would use capitalism of vying for monopolies and looking for any sort of edge and mass production and pushing your enemies to the wall, and concentration of economic decision making in a very few hands, like the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and whatnot.
Right.
And that's a direction that has gone. And whether America was really all that exceptional, Britain was about as bad. There were certainly some untidy, industrial magnates in France and Germany over the years as well. You can go back to the Roman Empire, and there were some really terrible, people like Crassus and whatnot, but it's a thing it's a thing that can happen a lot of places, and maybe it happened more exceptionally, or a larger number, more frequently here. But yeah, it's that's the other side of it. Like, fundamentally, if this was such an awful place, why do so many people try to get here, by hook or by crook in any way that they can?
That's right. Yeah. And it's not because, we as human beings in America are different from human beings elsewhere. In fact, that's one of the points in Fratelli Tutti, that, we really are on a global scale, brothers and sisters with each other, all reporting into the same creator with all the same inclinations toward goodness and badness. But what makes each individual, there are things that make each individual nation not exceptional in the same sense, but distinctive, and and each individual person, Francis would say, is distinctive and unique, and hence has a different, reflects that God has a different purpose for that person, I think, and so if there's anything exceptionalistic, to use that word, about America, it's not so much human nature by any means, but it's, that we have this really incredible Constitution that I might say, in the theme of our conversation, the Constitution is something that helps us focus our attention as citizens on the purpose of it all. And that's another threat right now that I see, that the loss of interest in the Constitution, and the whole idea of being endowed by our Creator with inalienable.
Right. Well, I mean, the whole point that it's the point of the Constitution is not to use it as, a framework where we can, the game is simply to try to cram into its wording whatever we want to see there. As opposed to, it's like Chesterton called it the democracy of the dead. He didn't call the Constitution specifically that, but tradition in general, which, a written Constitution is functionally it's a default. It's a means of settling disputes, that if you cannot get a substantial enough, majority in the present to overturn, precedent, which is to say the wisdom of the past, although
I like that. Right.
So, how dare we think of things that way, because all those people are awful, racist, sexist, homophobic, blah, 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 blah people.
Yeah. We're trying to undermine the whole idea of precedent as having any kind of value.
We're sure that the past has, people from the past have nothing valuable to say to us, because by God, they were all slave owners and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Of course they weren't all, and that's another story, but but key people were.
Right.
And yet, and that's the thing that doesn't tarnish, it's like if, God forbid, Adolf Hitler at some point probably had a good idea.
Yeah.
It's like, that's the whole, it's a well-known, it's a fallacy. It is, the fallacy of the ad hominem argument. Well, this person thought this and that was a bad person, so obviously this must be a bad idea. It's so permeated, our thinking, and it's another, aspect of fallen human nature that we basically can't get away from completely, although we could try to mitigate it, is you don't even need to think, you don't even need that last explicit step of thought. Well, that was a bad person, and therefore that idea, you don't even need to go there. And it's like, of course I can't, I'm not allowed to think that. It's like
that's
saying,
right. Yeah.
If depending on wherever you're at, if Martin Luther thought it, or if Adolf Hitler thought it, or if, somebody who owned slaves thought it or wrote it, well, then we must expunge that. And that's insanity. That's simply insanity.
Yeah. The demonization of people is just another shortcut in reducing the number of people that we have to pay attention to. Right?
Yeah.
Whereas we should be paying attention to their ideas and paying attention to the goodness and badness inherent in them and in us.
Yeah.
Demonization tremendously oversimplifies. Like St. Augustine, he had some bad ideas early in his life, right? Or bad practices.
Yeah, there are things that he even wrote, later in his life that, we can legitimately, because it works in this direction too. Like, not everything that Augustine wrote makes sense.
Right. Uh-huh.
He could have been a little too hung up on me. If you read like the latter parts of the Confessions, as I recall, like he was so worried, as far as I could tell from the text, about like that he was enjoying smells too much.
Gee whiz.
Because of course he's going through, he's making an inventory of of everything, the possibility of concupiscence. And
And that's a worthwhile thing to do, that sort of systematic thought, theological and philosophical thought. But, he's sort of swept away by a certain, hatred of the material world that was endemic in, ancient culture. And, he was kind of swept away by it. Probably, I think it's very possible anyway, and it's certainly possible at any point to say that about anybody. And it doesn't mean that they were, and that's the thing. We don't need to come to that judgment. That's the beautiful thing, is we don't even need to come to that judgment whether this is a good or a bad person, in a global sense, because they we obviously need to make a prudential judgment about, I'm going to read what Pope Francis writes and take it seriously. And I'm going to read what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez writes and treat it much more skeptically. And that's fine, but it's not like I'm going to throw everything that she says away, by no means. And I'm not going to read what Pope Francis says without any sort of critical apparatus either. So if he's talking about geology, I'm like, I'll think about it.
Yeah.
He may be glossing something over a little too much. But
he's feeling the need to venture into this immense world of policies on everything that are connected to policies on everything else, just as I think the general body politic and the general people of goodwill in Catholicism and other religions, we're all starting to realize that now is the time to really focus on things that, the cans that we've been kicking down the road for so long. And there is a lot of stuff that's really requiring our attention in civil society and in the secular world. So we shouldn't be surprised that his content in these encyclicals is a little bit more secular oriented. We already had popes like John Paul and Benedict, who did perfect jobs of being attentive to theology and philosophy. Now it's this turn for this more pastoral pope to say, well, let's talk about what everyday life should mean and what the trends in our society mean.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great shift of attention.
Yeah.
But now we have to, you're right. That's another way in which we can weaponize our attention to that, because we can either oversimplify it or attach him to some political opinion or one side of an issue. Whereas just the fact that he's connecting everything to everything else, to me, is a kind of act of transparency, a kind of honesty, where he's saying, let's think this through together.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is still a long read. I'll admit that. The Fratelli Tutti. Yeah, that's
all of them are, I think.
I guess right. Well, because he's even in Laudato Si, the whole essence of it is seeing connections, the ecological approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess another difficulty, honestly, that I have, and this is just a difficulty that I specifically reading Pope Francis, is that I get really depressed reading Pope Francis, because it sounds like it's just this enormous litany of what's wrong with the world, which, he's in good company there. Any number of popes and other spiritual, bishops and other spiritual leaders over the centuries who've written, in very much that vein. And I just get depressed, and I feel like sometimes I get, I myself know that, I am apt toward despair and hopelessness. And so I need a regular shot of, but God is in charge, and there are ways, and He has the grace, and will give us the grace to do something about this, to at least we individually live our lives differently, or we collectively, the people who are listening to our call as Christians, or listening to God's call, even outside the church, but it's still the same universe and still the same God, and we're still human beings who are intended to be His children. That I just need more explicit reference to that than I seem to get from what I've read of Pope Francis, unfortunately.
Part of it is just the times that we're in, that he's addressing times that are more of a day-to-day kind of trial that we're facing. I think that he's probably got a pretty good positive approach in a lot of his daily prayer and daily thinking. One clue to that is that, at least in the World Communications Day messages, of which I'm a big fan, and I think I forget whether it's in his encyclical or not, but certainly the World Communications Day messages, he ends with a prayer. Mm-hmm. And that's a sign of hope. It's kind of like the Lamentations in the Bible, in the Psalms, where you start off focusing on all the really lousy stuff that's going on. Yeah. And then, but ultimately, it's a statement of hope.
Yeah. I mean, that is the remarkable thing about Lamentations and the Lamentation Psalms, that they nearly all end with some positive. Although the one that we read for Friday night, Compline, is remarkable in that it ends. What is that? I forget. My one companion is darkness. Is the last line of that song.
That's the last line of. Oh my goodness!
That one. I mean, that one is it's so bizarre. Like the rules in the version of the offering, the common one that's around in the United States. If you pick up the Christian prayer book or. The Liturgy of the Hours, the copy that I actually have from the 70s, because my brother's college, discarded it from the library. Like, okay.
Wow, very cool.
That's too bad.
Very cool.
But they read that on Friday night, and and yet the rule is, but on solemnities, and definitely on Good Friday is apparently going to count as a solemnity. We read these ones from either Saturday night, which counts as part of Sunday, or Sunday night. And I'm like, but that's the absolute best psalm we could possibly ever read at the point at which Jesus Christ was dead and buried. Like, how could we skip reading this psalm? Like the most appropriate day of the year for it. Well, we've got it on a P. It's right here.
Yes.
But I don't think our liturgical reform. I mean, of course, the church is always reforming the liturgy. It's just, it was a little bit more dramatic in the mid 20th century, but I don't think we're done reforming the Liturgy of the Hours at this point either.
I think there is a slight rewording going on right now for the Liturgy of the Hours to make it more compatible with the revisions in the Mass texts. I forget exactly how or why or what's going on exactly, but changes are the only constant.
Yeah.
But, well, that's the whole idea of attentiveness, to be attentive to change, because there's an element of good in it and an element of bad that has to be addressed. But change is not a reason to be inattentive or to just be totally distracted by the new information that comes at us every day or whatever. I think a lot of people tend to just be distracted.
Yeah. The crowd in Julius Caesar that turns on a dime and, goes from supporting Brutus and Cassius to supporting Mark Antony and turning against them.
Yeah.
Where we're not sure from one moment to the next what we.
Yes. Yeah. We're fickle. People don't know, what's true one day seems to be untrue the next day. And a lot of the anchors that we hold dear in our minds are being challenged a lot. Some very appropriately, and some not so appropriately, I think.
Yeah, some very deconstruction for deconstruction's sake is, yeah.
Very good point. That's a good word for it. Yeah, that's what's happening.
Women's studies around, the turn of the 20th century, they, of course, pulled some quote classic text from probably the 60s that was, and we need to identify all of this patriarchy everywhere in the culture, and then we need to tear it down. And then, what are we going to do then in this blasted intellectual cultural landscape? What are we going to do then? Very
good point. Yes. Yeah, that's why it's so dangerous. Yeah, and we saw tendencies toward that in 2020, that, the frustration of some people was so great, or their strategy was so immense, that they thought that the only way to create change was to tear everything down and start from scratch. And I don't think that's ever worked or could ever work, right?
No, that's a video game tactic. That's a right click on all the buildings and tear them all down and take the credit and then build something new.
What a good insight, Paul. That generations that have been raised on video games are going to be more inclined toward that. And it's almost, didn't we tune into the news some nights and see scenes of cars burning and buildings being looted and everything that were reminiscent of video games or of, the worst kinds of depressing action movies?
Yeah. We've been feeding, especially, young adults, teenagers, and, the YA literature has been focused on the apocalypse for so long. For probably 20 years.
Yes.
It's like we're just all expecting it. We're just kind of waiting for it to happen. I wonder.
Yes.
I find myself wondering if that's not a subliminal possibility there.
I think that's a really good point, and probably we need more books to start being written from that psychosociological perspective. People are wondering, how is life change? Why is life changing so radically? Why are people's politics and perspectives changing so radically now? A lot of it has to do with the technicalities of everyday life, income disparities and stuff like that. But much more than we realize has to do with the entertainment culture, the short attention span culture.
Yeah.
All of the things created.
What causes income disparities, right? It's like, there's racial inequality. Well, what causes racial inequality? What are Black people or Hispanic people or whoever lacking that white people are getting, at least to some extent?
Right.
All of them. It's the ability to, it's not all external. And I think most people on both sides of the political spectrum have some understanding of this, but I don't know that it really turns into concrete, like, what should we do about it? I don't know that it informs what they think we should do about things as much as it should.
No. Oh, that's right. That's right.
It's that people, there's so many people who are being brought up in a manner that they don't know, as the saying goes, how to adult.
Yes.
They're being brought up by people who don't know how to adult.
Yes.
And that, it requires focus, and it requires, setting the ability to set a goal and take action over a long period of time to reach that goal. And that doesn't come for free. It can't be, that can't be assumed. And it's not, and by no means is it always, it's not easy to, it's easy to sort of just say, well, that's just either to go on one side and say, well, that's just a moral failing on the part of the individual person, or to go all the way to the other side and say, well, it's just all significant. It's just all systemic racism. And that's why these people can't, do these things.
Right.
That's why they can't, get a job, because they're just not, trusted because of their race. It's like, there are situations on those extremes, but there's a broad expanse in the middle. We're probably mostly somewhere in the middle, and where we've just broken the chain of people learning how to take care of themselves. I mean, like black people in 1920, what did they do for a living? Well, I mean, did they have a social safety net? No. And was that a good thing? No. But on the other hand, it's also like they took care of themselves. They farmed. They raised, kitchen, whatnot. They made soap. There's actually an article in my Notre Dame magazine there that was just about, that specific topic of, this, poor, well, black woman, making soap and stitching her own clothes, and because that's what you did, and if you didn't do that, you didn't get by.
Right.
And then now we have this excess of material goods, and we can sort of take it for granted, close to take it for granted that, well, there'll be a food pantry or something where I could get food, and there'll be somebody willing to hand out clothing, because the world is awash in clothing. I mean, literally, I go out on the south side of Indianapolis, and the world is literally awash in clothing. There's just stuff strewn along the trail, just along the path, along the side of the street. There's just so much.
Wow.
And, people, homeless people or whoever are wandering by, and it just gets left behind because it's just of such little value to people. It just doesn't seem to matter. And we don't, But then there are other things, like housing is so expensive relative to everything else now.
Yes.
And what drives that? I mean, that's not American exceptionalism. That's true across the world. But that's, there's so many of these things that, and it's not like I can sit here or Aida can sit there or, some policymaker in Washington can sit over there and engineer a solution that fixes it for everybody. That's, what are we going to do to help a few individual people? And then what are we going to do to sort of promote the idea that we could just help a few individual people? And if a lot of us help a few individual people apiece, things will look a lot different.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Of course,
a healthy
question of what should I do? What should I specifically do about it? And hoping to get to the point where I'm doing more about it in the very near future.
Yeah.
So
ultimately, it is about each individual's own mission and particular role in a pursuit. And that's what I was thinking about American exceptionalism. It's not that we'd even claim to have engineered a perfect society, but what's exceptional is, the Constitution and the founding principles that put us on a certain path of pursuit toward.
Well, and then there's also the Tocqueville angle of, what got things done in America for 200 years. Voluntary societies. I mean, and as Catholics, and and a lot of them were Freemasons, and that's kind of icky. But
I know where they exceptional qualities on all sides, right?
But,
interesting.
But the Knights of Columbus, or or a whole bunch. I mean, of course, the Tocqueville was in the country 50 years before the Knights of Columbus. So and then we're losing that, and that's what it's like that. In a sense, it wasn't rugged individual. I mean, it was. I mean, that's the funny thing, because of course it's both and.
Exactly.
There's an American both and. There's lots of both and. There's certainly the Catholic both and. But there was rugged individualism. There was Davy Crockett or Daniel Boone being like, I can see someone's chimney smoking over there on the horizon. It's time for me to move further west. Yeah, there was that aspect to some extent. But there was also, like, my ancestors, moving to Cincinnati and then, gathering together in a band and like, hey, we're going to start this town called Oldenburg out in the middle of nowhere in Southeast Indiana. These guys have got this, promising little plot of land by the creek. And actually it sounds like a good deal. So we'll go there together. We're going to build this little village and we'll build a tavern and we'll build a church. I don't know in what order they built those. They're probably both pretty close.
That might be human nature all around the world.
And we'll build a bridge, and we'll have a village council, and we'll do all the things together that and we won't always treat each other well, and we'll be catty and judgmental and gossipy, from time to time, and sometimes too frequently. And but they did it together, and they had, for the most part, in that particular instance, they had their Catholic parish as a central meeting point and glue, and they had not just the priest but various other lay people and who served as some sort of whether they were merely just like figureheads and points of reference. Sometimes that's all you need. Yeah, And now we really are so isolated. It's like I've, been living in this house and I don't, I've said a few words to some of my neighbors. I know one neighbor like 6 houses down because I met her, 10 years ago and 11, 12 years ago when I first lived in this neighborhood and went to a particular church. But yeah, I don't know a lot of people. And it's like, would that really have been the case if I moved here in 1835? Probably not.
Probably not. No, exactly. Yeah. Oh, it is fascinating how our attention is more dispersed and less precise than it was in the past, I think, and it's food for thought, and especially if we let it go to extremes that reduce our engagement with people and reduce our engagement and commitment to society, etc. And also to freedoms, the marketplace of ideas, as I've said.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, this is we've been very attentive to a lot of things here.
We've done our best. Yes. Yeah. So, gosh, yeah. There's the spaghetti of ideas, expands further from here. But I think this may be the point where we need to call it for today. So
we can definitely
both of us have some things that we need to think about yet this afternoon. So.
Oh, well, that's because the holiday season is coming upon us with all the changes, and we just can't wait for 2020 to end. But we can't wait for we're eager for 2021 to begin because there'll be all new episodes.
Yeah. And for quite a while, it will be all new episodes still in the world in COVID winter. But with the hope that things will stabilize and, between vaccine and the natural course of, epidemics that things will eventually get back to something resembling normal.
Something resembling normal. Yeah, that's right. Because again, it's human nature is a kind of constant around the world and through time.
Yeah.
So that's ultimately a good thing.
Yeah, we'll be traumatized and we'll do things differently for a few years, but we'll see.
It's an interesting point. Yeah. Well, we'll follow the trend and the change. But all the more reason for us to hold on to what you called earlier the democracy of the dead. There has to be some valuing of tradition and the learnings. I mean, of the past as well. History
doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And those who don't learn about the past are doomed to at least rhyme with it.
I like that. Yes. And sometimes it'll be a very profound piece of poetry, and sometimes it'll be a silly limerick.
It will be a silly limerick, a doggerel bit of verse.
Right, a doggerel. Yeah.
Let's try to learn from the past rather than just do half-hearted renditions of it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, we're trying to do a good job of that with this podcast series. We're trying to piece together the old and the new and the ways to combine them better.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah,
so,
and I think we're doing a darn good job. And
we're doing a consistent
let's
job.
Celebrate that for the holiday.
We've remarked several times this year, I think. So, so. All right. Well, this should wrap it up for, I believe this is episode 116.
Oh, my goodness.
Morgan can cut it.
Fair enough.
So,
right?
All right.
Yeah,
we'll see you in 2021.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas. Blessed Christmas.
Yes.
To you and yours, Paul.
Yes.
Yeah, and to our listeners.
Yes, to all of our listeners, for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of That's So Second Millennium. TSSM's audio producer is Morgan Burkhardt. Our theme music, Igneous Grok, was composed and performed by Vin Marquardt. For my co-host Bill Schmidt, I'm Paul Giesting. Until next time.